Hi again. So I'm back for part two of the lecture, Sociological Foundations. And in this part of the lecture, I'm speaking to you about some of the origins of sociological theory. So in the kind of wider context of academia, sociology is actually a relatively young discipline. So it emerged out of the kind of time of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So late 1700s, early to mid 1800s, that kind of time period. And the significance of these kinds of events, especially the Industrial Revolution, is the kind of social transformation that came along with them. So the Industrial Revolution was really quite a radical overhaul of the social order. So, for instance, many of the kind of working people moved out of regional rural areas and into urban centres. Urban centres became the kind of productive locus of societies. So there was a real shift in the kind of balance of power and the balance of the population from regional areas to urban areas. And so suddenly we had really large amounts of people living together in very close quarters. At the same time, we have the kind of ramping up of colonization and increasing experiences of kind of cultural exchange, cultural contact. Of course, this was happening a lot earlier than the Industrial Revolution, but with newer technologies, transport was faster than ever. So the kind of extractive relationships between the colonial powers and other parts of the world that were part of those colonies at that point in time were really ramped up. And so essentially, there was a kind of growing urbanized civil society that was very much dominated by this capitalist market economy. And then at the same time, in France, we have the French Revolution, the kind of overhaul of a political system, which was very much driven by French philosophy around the nature of society, the nature of power, all of these sorts of things. So it was a time of significant social change. And so it's probably unsurprising that all of these changes, the uncertainties wrought by them, and the inequalities that they generated prompted people to start to develop a new science for studying society, essentially. So some of the ways in which we can divide up these classical sociological figures to understand where they're sitting, what types of theorizing they're doing is by looking at figures such as this. So I'm going to talk to you today about Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, Max Weber, and Emile Durkheim. So those are the kind of four main figures we're focusing on, and you'll see that they're each pushing forward a particular sociological tradition, which I'll speak to you about as I introduce them. So I think linking these thinkers to the particular traditions that we can divide them into is a really good way of trying to see where exactly is their legacy and where are contemporary sociologists making similar moves, making similar arguments, drawing on similar ideas about the nature of the social world. So I'll explain some of these terms as we come to them. But I think the first thing that I would kind of like to explain to you, just as a way of organizing sociological theory in your mind, is the distinction between macro and micro theory. So these concepts are exactly what they sound like. Macro theory, as a kind of a blanket term to categorize a certain type of theorizing, refers to theory that is addressing the kind of large scale structural level of society. So looking at society as a whole, how is it put together? How does it function? How are kind of conflicts between different groups of people managed? And in contrast to that, microtheory is more interested in the level of kind of individual everyday life. So how do individuals interact with each other? How do we understand individual interaction? How do we understand, other people, especially in this new urban context in which people were coming into contact with incredible volumes of strangers in a way that they just wouldn't have done if they were living in, a rural kind of farming based village, for instance. And microtheory also covers theories of the individual, of self and identity. So the term here that you can see under the microtheory, phenomenology, literally means the study of consciousness. So phenomenology is the study of how we kind of process our thoughts, how we understand our own internal life. So macro theory is looking at kind of large scale, whole society kinds of issues, and micro theory, on the other hand, is looking at interpersonal interactions and even the individual and their own consciousness and thoughts. So this is, I think, a good way to divide major types of theory. So please do keep this in mind as we kind of talk through these classical theorists. So the person often lauded as being the first sociologist, Auguste Comte, was a French sociologist who lived from kind of late 1700s to kind of mid 1800s, and he's said to be the first sociologist because he actually developed the term sociology, or la sociologie, as he called it, because he was French. And so he basically was inspired by the physical sciences, and his idea of sociology was that it would be a science with which we could study society using similar kind of philosophies and methods as physical science studied kind of its object of study. So just as laws such as gravity govern the forces of the natural world, Comte argued that laws also govern the social world, and our job as sociologists was to study these laws and to understand them. And as well, the very first sociologists were not just focused on understanding society, they were also very focused on improving society. So they viewed sociology as a tool for helping society, for improving the welfare of humanity. This might not be through necessarily using means that we agreed with. For instance, some very early sociologists were aligned with things such as the eugenics movement. But nonetheless, they had an underpinning idea of not just understanding, but improving and acting upon society. And so, moving on from Auguste Comte, although we'll see the kind of legacy of some of his thinking even in the work of our three sociologists that we're focusing on in terms of the classics, we're going to now speak. I'm going to now speak a bit about the three founding fathers of sociology. So these are Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber, and they each kind of focused on different aspects of society. So as I'll say, Durkheim focused on social order. How do we have social order? What does it mean? What does it mean when social order breaks down? Marx focused on capitalism, essentially, the effects of the competitive economic structure that he saw around him. And then Weber was, in many ways, much more of a kind of micro-focused sociologist. He was interested in status, bureaucracy, and kind of understanding things from what we can call an insider position. So not only what is the objective kind of fact of this thing that we're observing, but how is it understood from the standpoint of the individual that's experiencing it. So I think that's quite an interesting move in a time at which there was conversation about kind of social laws and objective facts, all of those sorts of things. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that for any of you that have ever studied history, you'll have a sense that the people who stick around, or the people whose work is seen as incredibly important, incredibly influential, are not necessarily the only people that were around at that time, or even in many ways the kind of best or most knowledgeable. So it is important to keep in mind that these three figures are identified as the founding fathers in what we could think of as quite a revisionist fashion. So their work is the work that stood the test of time, and the work that is looked back to and referred to the most in contemporary sociology. There were other people working, but these three are the most influential. So I'm talking to you about them today because they have the most profound effect on contemporary sociology. So we need to understand where they were coming from and the moves that they were making to have a really good understanding of where we are now in sociology, in sociological theory. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them and kind of how they each approach the sociological endeavor, the study of social action, or social behavior rather. So Durkheim had a kind of very, very similar approach in a way to Comte. He was also French, and he was interested in studying society and studying social change by studying social facts, so similar to social laws. He was interested in the social realities that affected people's lives, whether or not they were aware of it. So perhaps, for instance, someone may not have been aware that the fact that they were born and identify as female affected their life quite profoundly. That may not have been something they'd ever really thought about, but to him, their awareness of it did not change the reality of it. And he was particularly interested in social order, and he was interested in how social order was maintained, how human societies lived together, how we all created norms. And he was also, because of his interest in social order and social norms, interested in what happened when these norms broke down. So he referred to a kind of situation in which norms break down, and by that I mean a situation in which there's a lack of shared understanding of how you should act, what's going to happen, how we can live together. He called this type of situation anomie. And to prove his point about the kind of significance of social order and social norms in social life, and the way in which these social facts influenced people's lives, whether or not they were immediately aware of this influence, he studied suicide. So he took suicide as a case in point because you can think of it in many ways as a very personal, very isolated individual act. And Durkheim set out to essentially demonstrate that suicide was not an isolated act. It instead was a social phenomenon and occurred along kind of social lines, depending on the nature of social norms and expectations in specific societies. And so to make this point, he compared Catholic and Protestant countries with the argument that Catholic countries and the Catholic Church more generally had a very, very strong focus on a kind of Catholic community, on coming to church and using the priest as the person who kind of mediates between oneself and their God, who provides moral guidance, and the way in which that brought together moral communities. And he compared this to Protestantism, which essentially is the idea, if this isn't something you've come across before, it's the idea of having a more individual, direct relationship with God. So rather than going through God's representatives on earth, as one does with the Catholic Church, Protestant, those who follow Protestant denominations would instead, focus more on like prayer directly to God, on kind of an individual relationship with God. And so you can see the difference. On the one hand, the kind of Catholic countries, Durkheim found that in these countries, suicide rates were lower than in Protestant countries. And he argued that in Catholic countries, there were very strong social bonds, very strong norms about how one acts, and that this was less the case in Protestant countries because there was more of a sense of individualism, more of a sense of having an individualistic rather than collective or mediated relationship with God. And he found as well, as well as kind of religious factors, he found that suicide rates were also seemed to be affected by marital status. So married people committed suicide less often than unmarried people, which suggested to him again the role of marriage. Not this isn't to say that married people are inherently happier. That may be the case, may not be the case. There's actually really mixed findings on that. Unsurprisingly to many of you, it depends a lot on gender, especially as you get older. Married men are happier and healthier, but married women are less happy and less healthy than those that are unmarried. So do with that what you will. But yeah, essentially marital status. Durkheim would argue that it wasn't that married people were happier, it was that they were more kind of socially connected through their place within, this institution of society, this very kind of recognized, marital bond and the role that gave them to play in society. And this is something I find really interesting. He also found that in times of war and natural disasters, people were actually less likely to commit suicide, that suicide rates actually declined during this time, which seems really counterintuitive. Like you would think that the kind of collective trauma would potentially increase suicide rates. That's what we worry so much about with the pandemic, the impact it is having and has had and will have on people's mental health. But Durkheim kind of at least from data in the time in which he was working, found that essentially war and natural disaster decreased suicide rates. And he theorized that this was because of the kind of social bonding, the shared sense of purpose. If you have seen all of those kind of old vintagey ads coming out of the UK during the First and Second World War about, banding together and working together and, the country, the total war effort and such. I think that's kind of really what he's getting at. And so we can see some kind of similarities between Durkheim and our next figure, Karl Marx. So I'm sure some of you have many of you, I would think, would have heard of before. So Durkheim and Marx are both very much interested in this kind of macro level of society. So Durkheim is interested in questions of social order, like how do we have a society? How do social norms allow us to function? And what happens when social norms break down? That's what he means by anomie. That's a situation of normlessness in which we lose our sense of social bond, lose our sense of what we should do, how we should act. So he's interested in how the social system works together. And Karl Marx was also very interested in the kind of large scale view of society, but he took something of a different approach. Marx is often referred to as a conflict theorist. So he's interested not in how we all kind of work together as a society, but rather where these points of friction appear. So he was very much interested in in inequalities and differences between different classes in society. So within his kind of class structure, he argues that there's kind of three main classes: the working class, who provides their labor but doesn't own anything necessarily; the ruling class, who own the means of production. So by this he means that they own the factories, they own the machines, they own the ships. So they own all of the resources that are needed to actually make these things that are needed in society at this time. And then the bourgeoisie, who kind of sit between the working class and the ruling class as a middle class, who are kind of between these dynamics. And for Marx, he essentially argued that if someone is born into the working class, this essentially sets their identity. It was pretty much unheard of at this time for someone to be born working class and then rise up to be part of the ruling class. This was a time of inherited wealth, inherited titles, and many people argue that this is still the case. We have much less class mobility than we might expect. This is the critique that people make of things like the American dream of upward mobility, the fact that it's actually incredibly unlikely. And we can see this kind of critique. If any one of you saw the kind of recent film Parasite, you can say this is a film that has a very kind of Marxist energy. And if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. It's really good. So essentially, I think when we're looking at Marx's work, it's really, really important to think about the context that he was working in and think about what he was seeing. So what is it that he is looking at and reacting to? So he was very much working, if you look at the time in which he was alive, he was working at the time of the Industrial Revolution. So he saw people working in these factories. He saw entire families working together. He saw child labor. He saw incredibly long working conditions, incredibly unhealthy working conditions, very, very low wages, and the real kind of exploitation of a large group of working class people by a smaller group of factory owners, or even those that were financing the factory owners. And so I think it's important to keep this in mind when we're thinking about his work. The kind of conditions that he was seeing around him really strongly influenced his outlook, his analysis, the type of theory that he developed. And so Marx was particularly interested in trying to understand the conditions faced by workers, and he was interested in trying to understand the lives of workers and how their labor was experienced. And so he developed the concept of alienation to refer to how people felt when they were working in a capitalist system. So in a factory, for instance. And he argued that workers, because they were doing mechanical, repetitive tasks, you can imagine you might be, standing in front of some kind of like mechanical loom thing all day, like working with like cotton or linen or something like that. And maybe you would, move the machine back, move a thing over, move it forward, move it back, move it forward. You're doing incredibly unskilled, repetitive labor that almost reduces you to a biological machine. You're kind of turned into not a person who's thinking and feeling, but basically a thing. And because you're only needed for, this very, very general, very mechanical labor, workers could be pretty much replaced by any other worker. So it was difficult for them to have individually any kind of bargaining power. If they didn't want to do the work, there would be a lot of other people who would. And so Marx was interested in, if these conditions are so horrible. Why did people not rise up and overthrow the bosses and refuse to do this work and do something about it? And he argued that they didn't because they were kind of compensated like just enough and distracted just enough by a few things in their lives that were positive and like kept them satisfied enough to keep working even if they hated their working lives. So he argued that this was things like sex, religion, general consumption. So being able to buy things and feel that they were working towards something, even if the work in of itself wasn't very fulfilling. And this is where Marx's famous quote, "Religion is the opium of the people," or the opiate of the masses. That's where this comes from. This kind of idea of why people don't just rise up and refuse to work in this manner. And so Marx was really interested, again, in how social change can actually occur. What is the kind of root of social change? How do things change? And so he argued that change or any kind of movement, development in society always started at what he referred to as the economic base. So he would argue that basically anything that occurred in society, whether it would be like new ideas, new ways of doing things, a new kind of class emerging, basically anything had some kind of origin in the economic base. So it came from the kind of material relations of production. It was driven forward by like these economic factors essentially, and that would then filter up to kind of higher levels that would inform how institutions operate, and then it would inform social institutions. So things like families, schools, medical institutions, even legal and political things. So one of the reasons, for instance, using a kind of Marxist analysis, one of the reasons why in the UK, for instance, there was universal primary education and then eventually like at least universally available secondary education, is that there was a need to have a population that had a kind of at least a base level of education to be a productive workforce. So this is very much a demand that's coming from the economic base of society rather than people being educated and deciding education is good and then changing the way the economy operates. So Marx would really argue that everything, even ideas, ideologies, everything originates in of dynamics in the kind of economic base, in the relationships that we have in that type of space. And so Marx believed that he believed in something of a kind of evolutionary model of society. So he believed that society went through kind of different modes of production. And he's interested in modes of production because he thinks that social change, social development always originates in these economic relations. And so he believed that societies kind of went through various stages. So primitive communism, ancient slave societies, feudalism in the Middle Ages, and then early capitalism in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And he believed that eventually the next step would be a communist or socialist society that would be brought about through revolution, that would kind of come from the working class essentially struggling and overthrowing the ruling class due to the inherent unfairness of their economic conditions. And because he felt that in a very real way, because he's interested again in these economic relations, he kind of argued that workers really were the ones that created value. They were the ones that brought more to the table than the members of the ruling class, the owners of the means of production. And he essentially argued that workers labor and create goods, and through doing that, they create things that are then sold. But in order to make a profit, the members of the ruling class who, own the means of production, the factory owners, would sell, for instance, a pillowcase for more than what it cost to make, so more than the sum of the materials and the labor. And so Marx understood this as surplus value, so value that's kind of added beyond, beyond what the kind of sum of its parts are. And he argued that essentially surplus value is created by the workers. They're the ones that are creating the product. They're creating something that can be sold and has a greater value. So he argues that workers should have this surplus value coming back to them as higher wages. They should be rewarded more directly for their particular labor. So for him, the nature of class society is essentially argument over this surplus value, over the profit. So does the profit, in contemporary terms, does the profit made by an organization go to the shareholders or the owner of the organization, or should it go more to the workers? Should the workers benefit from this? And if not, then why not? Yeah, and so basically, Marx argues that capitalism is essentially a relationship of domination and subordination in which, essentially the workers have to be convinced that they have a good deal, that they shouldn't get more than they already do, and they need to have some level of comfort, or at least believe that they live in some kind of good society, or believe that things can get better. And he would refer to this as ideology. And we can think of the notion of the American dream is a really, really good example of this, because that idea is, it's so influential in that, people that, just on a basis of statistical likelihood, are probably never going to experience a kind of elevation of their living standards. They're never going to experience like economic and social mobility, but the belief that they can and they're free to strive for that, and if they work hard enough, they will, that ideology keeps them engaged in the system, keeps them, optimistic, and essentially means that they don't really make too much trouble. And so Marx would argue that in contemporary times, this is essentially why we have minimum wages, why we have gradually rising standards of living for most people, why we even have income support, why, for instance, during the pandemic, there were income support measures coming from the government. And by the same token, he would argue that wages in Australia couldn't be radically and suddenly cut back, because the working class would presumably revolt, and they would also lose their own purchasing power, and they would no longer be able to be a kind of customer base. So Marx was focused on social structures, and he was particularly interested in this kind of base level of society. And he was particularly interested in how kind of economic factors drove human behavior. He really felt that people's lives were determined by the kind of outcomes of these economic factors. But we can critique Marx because, by focusing so much on social structures and so much on the kind of, base of society, the economic base of society, he didn't look very much at, individual, like human life and human interaction and ideas and all of those kinds of things. So, it really depends on what you think is important within sociological theory and what type of analysis you're trying to advance. But for Marx, he doesn't look a tremendous amount at the kind of everyday level of lived experience necessarily. His analysis doesn't really take place on that particular level. And so that brings us to our final sociological or classical sociological theorist, Max Weber, who took quite a different approach. And Marx was focused on the economic base of society, the means of production. And in contrast to that, Max Weber was very much interested in what can be called the superstructure. So this just means the world of ideas and meanings. Marx thought that essentially ideas and meanings flowed through from economic dynamics and economic determinants, whereas Weber takes a really different approach. He thinks that society is essentially driven forward not by simply economic interactions, but by new ideas. And so he puts forward this type of idea or this type of thinking in his very famous essay, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he's essentially advancing an argument that capitalism was helped along in many ways and developed alongside the kind of spread of Protestantism through many of the societies in which he was kind of working and analyzing, due to the kind of this worldly work ethic that is instilled in Protestantism as a kind of religion. So he was interested in how essentially the nature of a certain religious idea could be related to and push forward capitalism as an economic system. So you can see this is very much looking at how the realm of ideas and religiosity was related to and had a kind of corresponding relationship with and was pushing forward these kind of economic dynamics. So it's very much the opposite of the way in which Marx would approach the nature of social change, societal movement and development. So Weber's quite interesting in that way. And Weber was concerned with rationalization. He was interested in how society was living in an increasingly rationalized, bureaucratic kind of way. And I think some of his predictions about the kind of impact and outcomes of increased bureaucracy are very, very relevant for the contemporary age. He essentially warned against elevating the rule above the reason. So elevating the policy for why you kind of do things above the reason why they're done. And I had my own experience of bureaucracy and the elevation of the rule above the reason when I needed to travel to Melbourne recently. So it was when like earlier this year, there was concern about travel between New South Wales and Victoria due to some COVID cases in Sydney. And so the border had recently opened up and you needed to get a permit before you could travel down to Melbourne. And so the border was essentially open, but if you showed up at the airport without a permit, then you would get a big fine. So I did not want to do that. But the permit system, the website crashed and was down for hours. So essentially, I couldn't go or do anything because of this rule, which kind of was elevated above any kind of reason people could have for wanting to do things, and was not functioning correctly, and was basically a case of bureaucracy. So Weber was also quite interesting because he emphasized status rather than class, so in opposition to Marx. And so an example of this is that coal miners might, or like fly in, fly out workers, for instance, earn really good money, really great salaries, but they would not have the same kind of social status as a doctor, for instance. So he, again, through this example, is less interested in economic relations than he is in ideas and what things mean. And so Weber was very much interested in kind of social action. And so I think he's quite interesting because he's our first more kind of micro level theorist. He is interested in meaning making and individual relationships. He's interested in the kind of interactions and even in individual kind of understandings of things. So he was very much he was much less focused on social structures than Marx. Weber wanted to look inside social structures and see what they were made up of. He was also very interested in kind of placing himself into the picture of research, or trying to understand the role and the position of the researcher. So he argued that we should place ourselves in the position of the person we're trying to understand. So this is very far away from, if we go back to our kind of first figure, Auguste Comte, this is quite far away from what he was saying. This is very far away from objective social laws and positivism. This is more moving towards trying to understand people's positions, subjective realities. And he argued, Weber argued as well, that we should be reflexive about the kind of judgments that we make as social researchers. And by this, he basically means that we should try to understand and take account of the ideas that we bring to anything that we're researching. So how does our lived experience, our personal history, how does that impact upon what we're looking at, what we're trying to understand? So basically, as we'll see in the next part of this lecture, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim were incredibly influential on early sociology, and they're still incredibly influential because really, even those who critique these kind of early forefathers, their critiques are really based on disputing these ideas or moving on from these ideas. So they're still in dialogue with these three. And to some extent, each Mark Weber and Durkheim were interested in social structures and interested in points of conflict to some extent, although I wouldn't say that's so much the case for Weber and Durkheim. But I think as well, we can see that they each advanced quite different points. And I think that gives us something really interesting to kind of carry forward into our discussion of contemporary sociologists, the fact that they disagreed with each other. They made quite different points, and yet they're all still used. So sociology is not a discipline that has what you might call an orthodoxy. It doesn't have a one kind of agreed upon theoretical approach that is used by the majority of sociologists. And that is the case in disciplines like economics, for instance, that there's a kind of orthodox type of economics, and those who disagree with it are heterodox economists. Sociology is a much more pluralistic field. I think it reflects the kind of complexity that we're trying to study. And so these points of difference and disagreement, they're very much carried through into contemporary sociology. So I think this helps us to see that when we're using social theory, it's not really about who is right necessarily. It's more about which approach helps us to understand our research object in a useful way and to answer the questions that we have posed, or even to create questions that are going to produce meaningful answers. But I'm potentially getting a little bit ahead of myself, so I will leave it there for now.